As the Executive Director of the Americana Music Association, I welcome you again to our 25th birthday party. And it's an honor to be able to produce this event with Dana and Michelle and Craig and Destiny and Clara and Tara and Tino and Michelle. Dana, help me out. Is that it? Okay, how ridiculous is that? That's it. And it's an incredible amount of work, and I'm really grateful for everyone on our staff. We probably have about 130 volunteers. It's an amazing production, and it keeps getting better and better, and I'm just grateful to you all for continuing to support us in the way that you do. Today is very special because in large part, and I'm going to let the moderator or communicator, as you will, introduce our guest, who truly is one of the pillars, founding fathers, godfathers of what has become Americana, and a really very important side of Americana amidst the umbrella. So without further ado, I will introduce you to my great friend, Dr. Warren Zanes. Author of Nebraska. What's that?
Me from Nowhere, the making of Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska.
Okay. Author of Tom Petty.
Petty, the biography.
What am I could go on. We've been friends for about 20 years. He's one of the best people on the planet and one of the smartest people I know. So have fun.
Okay, I'm going to do this from a sitting position, even though that's not my style as a professor. Thank you to Jed. This event here, this is like my cup of tea. The man that I'm going to be speaking with means an enormous amount to me, as he does to many others. How many of you were at the show last night? Yeah. You didn't just get to see Dave playing, you didn't get to hear his voice. You got to see Dwight Yoakam talking about Dave, which to me was very, deep and meaningful. And it was Dwight that I identified with in that moment, because I kind of feel the same way. I was at boarding school, 17 years old, and my brother called me on the dorm payphone, and I had forgotten to fill out any college applications, so I didn't exactly have a future figured out. And my brother called and asked me if I would join his rock and roll band. And this kind of came out of nowhere for me. And he said, I'm doing this because last night I saw this band, the Blasters, and there are two brothers in that band. Now, we were both so naive, we didn't know the bundle of trouble that comes with this. But it was Dave Alvin who started the whole damn thing for me, just by being a brother up on a stage with a brother. So that's among the things we'll talk about. But from that point forward, Dave's been a mentor to many, a teacher to many, but he's also had a lot of teachers. And the history of American popular music showed up for this fucking guy. And I want to talk about the education of Dave Alvin today. But before I bring him out, I want to say, because time is limited, we're not going to play clips of songs that are being referenced. But I want you to write down the names of songs and then go listen to them later. So there's homework. We'll meet back here tomorrow, and there will be a quiz. My friend, a hero of mine, Dave Alvin. Okay, so I like a chronological orientation, Dave. So I want to start in the spirit of looking at this education of Dave Alvin, I want to start in the family home, not with Phil, but with your parents.
Yeah.
And in your new book, there's a moment with your mom, and she says, you have California bloodlines.
Mm-hmm.
And, not all parents take a moment to say, hey, this is part of the fabric of your identity. Even that small comment, it has a weight to it. Take me into that household. Take me to your mother and father, and what part of your identity you would say comes from them.
Oh, well, a lot, I think for all of us, right? But my parents come from a mixed marriage, Catholic and Protestant, And my mother's family was multi-generational Californians that had come from, my ancestors on that side of the family had been here since the Pilgrims, kind of maybe similar to yours, I don't know. And then my dad's side, my old man's family were Polish immigrants, and they my old man grew up in South Bend, Indiana, in the Midwest industrial Rust Belt, and so I inherited. And he went out to California in the Depression. He rode the rails out to California, and so I have both those things. Of my old man was he loved California, and he was skeptical of it.
Yeah.
And my mother just loved California, and so.
So take me to your California, to Downey. If you could give me a picture of like the pre-rock and roll, if there was a pre-rock and roll experience of Downey for you.
Downey was always, well, Downey, where I grew up, then, what it was like then was because of the various post-war and pre-war diasporas, Downey's in southeast LA County, and the southeast side is the non-glamorous side, You'll never catch a Kardashian in Downey, but when my brother Phil and I were little kids, there was music everywhere because the people that came from, whether they came from the Midwest or the South or from Europe or from Central and Latin America, or no matter where they came from, they brought their music, and we figured out fairly early on that you could, not only did you hear it on the radio or on jukeboxes and in the hamburger joints, but there's bars which you could sneak into and hear everything from blues singers to soul singers to people singing Sophisticated Lady and Stardust, to norteño bands, to hillbilly bands. You could hear it all.
So did your brother Phil get to it before you and bring you into it?
I don't think so. Well, he's older, so he got into everything before I did. But no, my favorite thing, when I was a kid, the first thing I learned how to do manually, the first two things I learned how to do. One was on my mom's 49 Studebaker. I learned how to work the radio, and then those days radio was really great because you could hear, you'd hear a country station, flip it, and you'd get a rock and roll station, R&B station, flip it, you get a jazz station, flip it, you could get everything, And then the other thing I learned how to do manually was work the record player, And so I learned how to stack 45s, and I had a rocking chair, or a rocking horse, and the rocking horse was next to the record player, and I would play, Marty Robbins' El Paso on repeat. You could just hit the button and just do this. this, you know. Hit it again, and that applied for, you know, LPs. You know, I remember we had Ricky Nelson's first record, you know, first album, and put on Ricky, you know. And so, yeah, so when I was like 3 years old, I was already playing records and messing with the radio. So, and I didn't see my brother doing that. But no, we kind of, Phil and I, you know, our parents, my mom was a factory gal. You know, she worked in a factory. That's how she met my old man. My old man was a union organizer. And she had wanted to be, in the 30s, she was a small-time vaudeville contortionist and dancer, which we didn't know about until we were like in our late teens, and these photos showed up of our you know, 12-year-old mother with her head coming up, you know, just amazing stuff. And then her first husband was a no-good bum, and he forced her to give up those dreams, you know, and so my mom was really good to my brother and I regarding our musical career, because she was kind of living out the career that her no-good bum first husband had squashed in her. And that's why I don't like people that squash dreams, you know. But that's another subject.
So talk to me about when you like really actively start going out to clubs with Phil. And did your parents know you were doing this? Was it on the sly?
Well, a little bit of both. My mom, the first rock and roll show I ever saw, my mom drove me to, and I had no idea I was going to it. And it was just get in the car, okay. And my mom was driving my older sister Mary and like 4 of her friends to the Rose Bowl to see, I think one of my sister's friends had won these tickets by be the first to dial, or, you know. And the show was Herman's Hermits were the headliners, which was kind of, you know. But the other acts were the East LA Midnighters, the Turtles, the Love and Spoonful, and the Bobby Fuller Four. And so my first rock and roll show was the Bobby Fuller Four, and I remember seated outside, and I'm not sure what they played, because it was before I fought the law, but I remember everything else. I remember what they were wearing. I remember, you know, the attitude that the Bobby Fuller Four put off, which was pure energy. It was like punk rock, you know, except punk rock in really neat sharkskin suits, you know, and it was two guitars, 2 electric guitars, bass and drums, and just sitting there going, oh my God, because here was this radio stuff that was now coming alive, right? And the Love and Spoonful was incredible because they just had their first hit. And I've discussed this with John Sebastian, and he has checked my memory. Everything I experienced as a 9-year-old kid, he said, yes, that's the way it happened. And they had just put out Do You Believe in Magic, but nobody knew who they were, right? Especially on the West Coast. And they were basically doing like jug band and blues stuff. And the teenage girls, which was the audience, were kind of like, you know. And then he says, well, all right, you may not have really cared for our other songs, but you'll know this one. And then the chords began to Do You Believe in Magic? And then it was Beatlemania, you know. Then wow. They were like, and then the you know, whatever, 12,000 teenage girls that were there were like, those guys, you know. And so that was my first rock and roll show. My mom took me, and then later on, my mom would take me to, when I was like 13 years old, she would take me to see Jimi Hendrix, and she'd sit out in the car, and me and a couple of my friends, Greg Truesdale and Joe Sincack, we'd go in, and my mom would make me a sandwich and say, do not eat anything in there. Do not drink anything in there. And what she didn't realize, or maybe she did, was that the real drugs were what were coming off of just Jimi Hendrix. You know, it was just, you know, because the thing about seeing Jimi Hendrix was you had, you know, it's besides the guitar pyrotech, or not pyrotech, the guitar stuff. You never knew, you had no idea what Jimi Hendrix was going to do. And I saw him twice, and each show was completely different because you had no idea. What's he going to do? Oh, wow. No, wow, oh, ah, you know. And to me, that's something that's definitely lacking in a lot of contemporary music, is there's not enough, what are they going to do, you know?
So you're in a Rose Bowl, you're
Yeah.
at a Hendrix show.
Yeah.
There's, you know, I haven't been to any Hendrix shows, but I have been in a venue where there's that distance between me and an amazing performer. But let's go into like the Ashgrove shows
Yeah.
and stuff, where you started coming closer to the
Yeah.
artists, and actually relationships started to unfold.
Well, the thing about Jimi Hendrix, I just have to say, is Jimi Hendrix made you feel close. You felt close to him just because, you know, he was one of those people that the charisma was off the charts, you know. Jackie Wilson was like that when I saw Jackie. When I saw Michael Jackson, same kind of thing, you know, just charisma off the charts. But now, yeah, the Ashgrove was probably about the size of this room, the performance space. And yeah, you could sit right there. Reverend Gary Davis, who they gave a lifetime, I saw one of his last shows at the Ashgrove, at one of his last shows, period, but it was at the Ashgrove, and it was the craziest double bill, most wonderful double bill ever. It was Reverend Gary Davis near the end of his life, and he's playing acoustic guitar, and he's singing these songs about, he knew that he was near the end, and so he's doing songs like, I will do my last singing in this land someday, somewhere. And the other act was Johnny Guitar Watson. And Johnny Guitar Watson, just to make the night even more special, you know, was, you know, where Reverend Gary Davis was old and near the end of his life, Johnny Guitar Watson was young and electric and loud and had been arrested earlier that day and had to be bailed out of LA County Jail by Ed Pearl, who owned the club, the Ashgrove. And so he was mad. And so you had this beautiful thing of anger and then transcendence. And so I'm sitting right there where you're sitting, watching this going, how does this make sense? You know, and you look for the connection between Reverend Gary Davis and Johnny Guitar Watson. And then I realized, oh, it's all the same. You know, it's all part of this, you know, one, it's all the same notes. It's played differently, but basically the songs are working inside of a pentatonic blues scale, right? And one comes out of the other, and the other leads to the other. So it's like, I'm not making much sense. Good morning, it's too early. But that's like one of the major things that I learned. So when people, when I go through periods, say if I'm playing primarily acoustic, and people are bitching about me not playing loud, to me, I'm just, you know, it's all part of the same thing. And then vice versa, when I'm playing too loud and people are bitching that I'm not playing acoustic. I came here to hear, you know, King of California, and you're playing that, you know, and it's like, it's all the same notes, you know, it's all the same thing. But there is that, thing about the Ashgrove was, you could have experiences like that. It was, you went to the Ashgrove not only to hear the music and have a good time or whatever, and I'm 14, right? I'm trying to figure out the world, and but at the same time, the way that the music was presented there, and the weird mixing of acts like Reverend Gary Davis and Johnny Guitar Watson, you had to think. It made you think, or it allowed you to think, and it wasn't just, here's a beer, have a good time, shake your rear end. It was like, okay, where does this music come from? Why is Reverend Gary Davis and Johnny Guitar Watson connected? And the first time I ever went to the Ash Grove, it was my brother just threw me in the car. He at that point, I think he still wasn't driving. We were that young, and so he was like, 15 and a half, and I was like 13 and a half. And we had a ride, and he just said, get in the car, we're gonna go see Big Joe Turner. And so we drove Downey to the Ash Grove was 25 miles, and it was the Johnny Otis Orchestra, and I can tell you just about the name of just about everybody in his band. And it was a review, an old school R&B review, where you'd have various acts come up, and then that led you up to the headliners, who were Big Joe Turner, T-Bone Walker, and Eddie Cleanhead Vinson. And then they'd each do like 3 songs. And Johnny Otis had a band, horns, the whole thing, charts. It was all rehearsed. It wasn't North Mississippi blues. It was West Coast R&B blues. It was jump blues. It was, and it was just one of the most powerful things I ever saw. And I'd already seen Jimi Hendrix twice. But then in this intimate, quasi-intimate environment, and all of those guys, Big Joe and Eddie and T-Bone, they were at the tail end of their prime, but they were still in their prime. And so it was like, oh my God,
So what was the process of going from that experience to actually having mentor-like relationships with Johnny Otis and Big Joe Turner? These guys come into your life.
My brother and I and a couple of our friends became the equivalent of parrot heads or dead heads. We were Joe heads, because it didn't take us long to figure out that T-Bone and Big Joe and Eddie and countless others of old blues performers lived in LA. And they didn't live that far away from us. And they were playing shows. They weren't just playing, at the Ash Grove. They would be playing at Vina's on Western, or on Adams, or the York Club down on Florence. And you could go see them there too. And so wherever they played, there would be these 2 little white kids, Hello, Big Joe. And my brother always was born, with a loud mouth, and he could, no, it's true. I don't say that as a joke. Phil could imitate Big Joe right off the bat. He figured out, okay, here's how I'm gonna be cool. I'm gonna imitate Big Joe Turner. And so sort of, it gets complicated. There was an old retired blues singer named Mary Franklin, who was part of the old Central Avenue scene in LA. And her son, Ernie, came into a music store in Downey looking for guitar strings, started to talk with this guy named Doug Allgood, who was the bass player in my brother's teenage blues band. And that's how we got to know Lee Allen, the great New Orleans tenor sax player, because he said, oh, my mom knows, Big Joe and T-Bone, and oh yeah, we got to meet her boyfriend, Lee Allen, all this kind of stuff. And so then they came into our life, even though we had already been following them around, but they came in, and my brother had a really good teenage blues band, and they started backing up Big Joe and T-Bone and everybody. And when they would do these gigs, because we already had Gene Taylor, was like a 17-year-old, prodigy of blues and boogie woogie piano, and the area I grew up in, Downey, Norwalk, Southgate, Linwood, Paramount, those towns, there was a plethora of incredible guitar players. I don't know why. And in fact, to this day, there's a couple of guys from that area that I still consider two of the best. And whatever I do guitar-wise, I'm comparing myself to them, and I'll never be them. So, and these guys would go in and out of my brother's band, and yeah, we could spend the whole day just talking about that. Big Joe, for example, gave me my first songwriting lesson.
Can I pause just for your song lists? Big Joe Turner, Rollin' Pete. You got to go listen to that. Johnny Guitar Watson was mentioned.
Yeah.
Space guitar.
Space guitar.
So carry on.
Okay. Meet you here tomorrow. So yeah, and Big Joe, I was so young, I was still in grammar school. And I walked home from grammar school, and I was walking home, and I wrote a Big Joe Turner song in my head, right down to the horns, the horn parts, everything. And, because it was about 1.5 miles from my school to where we lived, so I'm walking. And so then a few days later, we went to see Big Joe at some bar, and I went up to him, and then I was like, Mr. Turner, I wrote a song for you, And he's like, okay, let me hear it. And I was like, and I couldn't remember it. And Big Joe Turner looked at me and he goes, well, if you can't remember it, it's no good to begin with. And I've lived by that rule, because I've co-written with a lot of people, where you go over to their house to co-write, and okay, here's an idea. I'm a happy duck, Oh, great idea. Let me get and they start, pushing buttons. Let me put a bass line down first. And I'm like, I just want to write about being a happy duck, So I don't record that way. I don't do 1 million demos. I don't sit around figuring out all the chord inversions to the 3-chord Happy Duck song. It's just like, well, it's the Big Joe Turner rule. If 2 weeks from now, if I'm walking around, I'm a happy duck, then it's a good song.
But at the same time, you said to me at one point, you also probably can't count the number of good songs you lost.
Oh yeah,
doing it
totally.
that way.
I lost a lot of good songs that way.
Yeah.
But I didn't write too many bad ones.
You said a thing that I felt was, and we're going forward, so we're in 1970.
Yeah.
You said you were driving home, and you just had this idea come to you. What if Raymond Chandler or Bukowski fronted a blues band?
Yeah.
And I think just to understand you as both a writer and a songwriter, because I think there's a distinction to be made. That moment, just take me into that, like where that idea would have come from and what it really meant for you as a narrative songwriter.
Well, I always liked narrative songs. El Paso by Marty Robbins, Memphis by Chuck Berry, the Lieber and Stoller stuff for the Coasters. But yeah, I was going to school at Long Beach State in Long Beach, California, and they had an incredible writing program with incredible teachers who were also sort of stars in the small press world of small press poetry. And I didn't know, I figured that, the Ash Grove had burnt down and was gone, and that world had kind of disappeared. And that world had been my world, like my goal in life when the Ash Grove was around was, I just want to go grow up and live at the Ash Grove. That's all I wanted to do. And then, so that world was gone, and punk rock hadn't really kicked in yet. But I started at Long Beach State, I couldn't find out what I wanted to do, you know. And I'd had a really crappy high school education that's a long story. Not that I'm responsible in any way for that. I was driving down 7th Street in Long Beach, and I was studying writing. And these were Elliot Freed, Richard Lee, and the man I mentioned last night, Gerald Laughlin, who was at one point in time the most published poet in America, because he just coded the small presses. Anyway, but they made us write in traditional poetic forms. We didn't write free verse. So we'd have to write sonnets, we'd have to write in blank verse, we'd have to write in haikus, you know, Alexandrines, you know. We had to study meter, you know, which I had, you know meter because you listen to music, but you don't really know meter until you study meter, right? And then you go, oh, wow, you know. And I wanted to, I felt this kind of, I never, you know, being a songwriter was never like a career goal, you know, and you've known people and interviewed people where it was. When, you know, I wrote songs when I was a little kid, but I never thought, well, I'm going to be a songwriter when I grow up, you know. That just wasn't a reality from where I come from. And, but I started feeling this burning thing of like, you know, writing poetry, studying poetry, that's all fine and good. But there's nothing like playing music, you know? And there's nothing like the blues. There's nothing like, you know, and how do you combine these two things, you know? And other people have, you know, Bob Dylan did it where he combined, you know, folk music and blues and rock and roll and country music with, you know, 19th century surrealist French poetry, you know, and, you know, with Arthur Rimbaud and people like that. So it had been done, but for me, I remember sitting, it was like 95 degrees, and I was driving this beat-up car in Chevy Impala that didn't have air conditioning, and sitting there in traffic and thinking, well, wait, what would it sound like if Raymond Chandler had a blues band? What kind of songs would Raymond Chandler write? Or what kind of songs would Ernest Hemingway, the young Ernest Hemingway, write if he had a blues band? Or Eudora Welty, what would Eudora Welty write? You know? And so when the Blasters, when we finally got together and we were just doing, you know, Junior Parker songs and Howlin' Wolf songs and Carl Perkins songs, you know. That's all we really wanted to do. And, but then, and Big Joe Turner songs, of course. And we wanted to get a record deal. And there was this crazy guy in LA at the time who was the champion of independent rockabilly. And his name was Ronnie Weiser. And make a long story short, we tracked him down and we played him the demo of us doing, you know, Carl Perkins and Big Joe Turner and Junior Parker and Howlin' Wolf. And he said, that's all great and fine, that's all great and fine, but, you know, if you don't have original songs, I won't make a record with you. So we had a band meeting and my brother said, okay, next week everybody show up with 3 songs. And I was the only guy that did. And so then, think you're a songwriter, you know. So, so I always, you know, that's how I became a songwriter. And it was when I sat down to write these things. It was like, well, what would Raymond Chandler do, you know?
There's some beautiful stuff in this book, which is available to you. I'm not plugging product, but one of the things I loved is a Blasters story about the Starwood and opening up for the Ventures. And you're presented with that gig. And what I want to get to is like, at some point, and I think it was you and the Blasters, is figuring out that you have a place in this other LA.
Yeah.
Which is an LA where Slash Records would ultimately put out, Blasters recordings.
Yeah.
Talk to me about navigating, because that's a transition, and it takes. I wondered if Phil had some resistance to it, or how you managed it, because you knew playing with the opening for the Ventures is not for us. Getting on a bill with X is for us.
Yeah.
Yet we remain exactly who we are.
Yeah. Well, the attitude of the Blasters, because the first year or year and a half, I was the booking agent for the Blasters. I was the one, because I was naive enough to think that I could do that. So I was on the phone all the time, calling nightclubs. Hi, we're this band, and we're from Downey, which...
Was your voice really like that, Dave?
Isn't it still like that? That's all I hear.
I think this is inner child stuff.
But, yeah, it was difficult for us to get gigs because of where we were from. And it's hard to explain to people that, because it's not that important of a thing, that the socio-cultural aspects of Southern California. We used to call it if you lived west of the Harbor Freeway, we didn't trust you. And because if you lived east of the Harbor Freeway, which is basically East LA and Southeast LA County, where we're from, it was impossible just about to cross the divide and get into Hollywood and get gigs there. And so we started out playing biker bars and the occasional sort of rough-hewn country bars. And then we eventually, long story short, we started getting gigs in Hollywood, and some people with big mouths like the Go-Go's and Anna Statman and Pleasant Gaiman and people like that spread the word that, hey, there's this band, they're from Downey, and they're really good. And we'd gotten really good by playing these biker bars for free beer. But then we were also into punk rock because we were all working day jobs, right? And then in 1977, sort of English punk rock happened. New York stuff had been going on already, but I was a fry cook, and I was living next to the place where I fry cooked, and I had a beard, and I had a really bad beard. And this show came on with Lloyd Dobbins, and it was a investigation of this wild new music coming out of England. It's violent, it's this, that, and the other. And I was just, and for the first time, going back to what I said about Jimi Hendrix, you had no idea what was going to happen, So if you watched, a lot of, let's say, some of the Sex Pistols stuff was really just theater in hindsight, but then you had no idea, right? And then they also had, Joe Strummer and The Clash, and it was just like, what are these guys doing? And then the mind blower was, they're talking about, these young kids, these young punks. And I was a year younger than these guys. And I was like, okay. Next morning, shave the beard, and we started going to the Mask in LA, and the Mask was LA's sort of, the only punk rock club, Brendan Mullen. And that was a beautiful time because punk rock has since become sort of a cookie cutter thing. But in the early days, it was a wide variety of stuff. Nobody sounded the same. X didn't sound like the Weirdos. The Weirdos didn't sound like the Screamers. The Screamers didn't sound like the Zeros. The Zeros didn't sound like the Bags. The Bags didn't sound like the Go-Go's. Nobody sounded the same. Everybody had their own weird, because everybody came to it, because it was basically, in LA and Southern California, punk rock was just the gathering of oddballs. It had nothing to do with, people came from a variety of backgrounds. There were people that came from glam rock, there were people that came from heavy metal, There were some groups, like DJ Bone Break from X, and that came from like Frank Zappa, and then there was us who came from blues and R&B, and everybody brought their own thing, right? And so for me, when all the guys on the Blasters, I was the weakest link, because I was the shittiest musician. Everybody else was a great musician. And they had been playing in, bars for years. And if you put the Blasters, get me out of there, which my brother wanted it several times, they could back up anybody. There was a circuit in Southern California along the coast, like say from Santa Barbara down to San Diego, of blues gigs, like blues lounge gigs, that various great musicians worked. And you could make a great living. Same with country rock. My dear friend Chris Gaffney came out of the world of the country rock beach circuit, with his band. His name just walked out of my mind. But I didn't want us to be that kind of band, I wanted us to be noisy. I wanted us to be, the one thing I learned at the Ash Grove with Big Joe and Lightning Hopkins and people like that is I could never be them. I can't. I want to. I still would love to be Lightning Hopkins if we could arrange that, but you can't. So I have to be, I got to be whatever oddball duck that I am, And that's where you try to weave the Blasters. We would open for Asleep at the Wheel one night, and the Cramps the next night, and then Queen a week later. Because I was like, we've got to play to everybody, because we'll take a little bit of everybody's audience, finally answering your question. And so that was sort of my master plan was, roots music, with the exception of, the amazing Mink DeVille, Joe and Jimmy with the Flatlanders, and, some smaller stuff like Ray Campy and the Rockabilly Rebels, or Robert Gordon and Link Ray. It wasn't cool then. It wasn't groovy. They didn't have award shows for it. It was forgotten. It was something that people were ashamed of. It was like it really took a little while for people to go, oh yeah, I kind of like John Fogerty. It took a while, to get people to drop their thing, because it was, the 70s had some great music, but it had a lot of bullshit. And if you were growing up in it, for me it was like I went from hanging out, in bars with Lightning Hopkins or Freddie King, and being a little kid in those situations, to suddenly a few years later it's just the Love Boat, and so anyway, it was important to me. But when you put the Blasters together, you take the guys individually, they could back up any blues singer, any country singer, whoever the hell, and they'll do it straight, and they'll do it. But you put the five of us together, and it didn't matter whether it was 1981 or when we've done periodic reunions, you put the five of us together and we'd play exactly like the Blasters. We feed off each other in that way. And so in my own solo groups, there are times in the shows where it's like, okay, I want you guys to sound like the Blasters. And then I don't want you to sound like the Blasters, It's kind of like that balance. But, those five guys, unfortunately, Gene Taylor's no longer with us, and Lee Allen's no longer with us. But even if you put, my brother's, not singing these days for health reasons, But it's still, if you put the four of us remaining on stage, we'd sound like we did in 1979.
This leads me to where I want to go. I was talking with Ry Cooder in an interview, and he was just saying, there will never be anything greater than the small combo. And when I was taken to see the Blasters, it was just like, it was certainly one thing, and it was power. And, I was fully in, but I would never think about removing one of those pieces and putting them somewhere else. And though an X is in there, knitters are in there, but I want to talk about when you really stepped out on your own, and what was good about it, what was hard about it, what you lost, because I'm sure there's on either side of the ledger.
You lose your brothers, because the Blasters all grew up together, and so when I left the band, I didn't realize I lost my brothers. And when you're a band and you get a great review, you show it to your, hey, did you see this? Did you see what they said about us? When you're a solo act and you get a bad review, it's yours. It's not the band, And there were reviews for the Blasters, one particular in the Boston Phoenix that still cuts to this day, where this guy wrote this full-page thing. What a great band, what a great singer. Oh my God, the legendary Lee Allen and this young kid, Steve Berlin, on saxophone. That's incredible. And the rhythm section, oh my God, what a powerful R&B rhythm section. Oh, and Gene Taylor's, this piano player, is the greatest boogie-woogie piano player. And then there's that guy, There's that guy playing guitar. Boy, they would be a great band if they could get rid of that guy. And his songs are terrible, and he jumps around like an idiot on stage, and And even that you share with the band, It's like, hey, am I really stupid? No, man, you're cool. And so when you go solo, it's the great thing is freedom. You can do whatever you want, right? But the sad thing is you lose your brothers. You make new brothers. But for a while, I was lost. And the other thing is you pay for everything. And it's true. Because when you're in a band, the Blasters had a way of working it where we didn't want to take tour support, because we thought tour support would put us in debt, which it does, to the record company, both financially but also artistically, where if you're in debt to the record company, they can tell you, make that disco record, Oh, okay, we'll do that. And so we wanted to be as independent as possible. So I had written a song called Marie Marie, which became this huge international hit. And I was barely a songwriter. And suddenly I'm getting these massive BMI checks. Well, we figured out, okay, David, you'll keep the writer's share, and then the publishing share goes to buying bands, bailing guys out of jail, paying for the road crew or roadie, And suddenly, when I went solo, it was like there was none of that. It was just, I pay for everything. I'm paying for the roadie. I'm paying for the vehicle. I'm paying for that's the biggest, that was the cold water, and it was shocking in my case, because my first solo album, I dared to put pedal steel on it, with my dear friend Greg Lease playing pedal steel, and I dared to have a couple of songs that could maybe pass as country songs, and I thought that would be no problem, right? But it became this huge problem where I did the record for Demon Records, Elvis Costello and Nick Lowe's label over in England. But we couldn't get a deal here in the States, and so because it had pedal steel on it. And I guess if you're Bob Dylan, you can put pedal steel on a record, they don't consider you a country act. Or if you're, whomever. But for guys like me, so there was this period in my solo career, the first couple years, of just, I lost track of who I was because outside influences were trying to tell me who I was. And there was a guy, because I eventually wound up signed to Epic out of this town, out of CBS Nashville, but I was a split signing. I was signed to CBS Nashville, which meant country, and I was also signed to CBS New York, which meant everything else. And the twain in those days did not meet. And there was the guy that handled radio for CBS New York, for the corporate. And he'd say to me, "Man, I love your band, man. You guys rock the fuck out, man. But I'm not fucking pushing anything that's got a goddamn pedal steel on it." And I'm like, "What? What's the problem here?" It's an instrument. It makes sound. It's very evocative. Why? And then on the other hand, down here, there was a great guy I loved named Joe Casey, who was the head of radio promotion for CBS Nashville. And he's like, "Dave, I love you, man. I love the songs, but you got those rock and roll drums, man. And I can't go to, WXYZ in Tuscaloosa, Alabama with those rock and roll drums," which is really funny now, when you hear what comes out of this town. And but I'm like, "What? It's a great drummer." And we put mics in front of it, and it's like, I didn't know. And suddenly I'm caught in this debate between what's country, what's rock and roll, and my attitude was, I don't give a shit. Yeah, I just write songs, and when you go solo and you're in a band like the Blasters, and even when I was in X for a little while, those bands have an identifiable sound. Dave Alvin didn't. And Dave Alvin not only had to pay the bills, but Dave Alvin had to figure out what the hell Dave Alvin sounds like.
Well, this is what I was going to ask, is you don't simply walk off with an acoustic guitar and start doing your thing. You're finding your voice. You're finding a position as a front man, and that doesn't just happen. No, that had to be learned because I'd never really sang before. So I had to learn how to sing. If you listen to my first solo album, you'll notice that I've never sang before. And Steve Berlin, who produced the record, he got me drunk to do the vocals. And so particularly, there's a version of my song Long White Cadillac on there that was, if you ever want to hear what I sound like on about a half gallon of vodka, just put that on. But we need to do multiple sessions here because
I just have to say, I owe a lot of it to a guy named Greg Lease. And Greg Lease was the guy that was in my band. He was a dear friend, but Greg was the one that listened to me, and he said, "Okay, this is how you sing, and I'm going to show you." And in the Blasters, for whatever reason, we were against capos. Greg handed me a capo, and he said, "You might be a B-flat guy." And I put the capo on, and suddenly I had this voice. And so it was things like Greg, it was things like I did some tours with Richard Thompson where I'd watch Richard Thompson, and he's got more of a range, but we're roughly working the same thing. It was like, okay, he's not singing. My heroes all sang above the songs. Whether it was Al Green or George Jones or Big Joe Turner, they sing above the band. Richard Thompson, people like that, Leonard Cohen, sing inside the song. And suddenly it was like, that's how you sing, or that's how I should sing. That's where my voice is. That's where I can interpret my lyrics, because I will say when I play acoustic, you get more of the songwriter. When I play electric, you get more of the sweaty rock and roller. But if I really wanted to get the song across, it'd be an acoustic thing, That's probably where I sound best.
it might make you uncomfortable to know how much my brother and I talk about you when we have conversations. But we were having one recently, and he had talked to you, and he was saying, you know, the thing about Dave is like you can kind of separate the world into those with gratitude for what they're doing and those that are kind of bitching their way through it. And he's like, man, Dave's like there ready to get in the van again. Like he's psyched to look at the itinerary. Just talk to me about that disposition.
Immortality. No, I'm serious. When you're playing live, when I'm playing live, I'm immortal. You know, I've had back in the punk rock days, you get hit with a beer bottle and you didn't feel it, because you're on that. It's like a runner's high. It's like now these days I like to hike, and if you hike and you're hiking alone, you can get kind of that zone, you know. And when I'm playing music live, you know, I used to ride horses, and when you get the right horse on the right trail at the right time, that's like having the greatest drummer. You know, you get that. You're living in the moment. You know, is this horse going to throw me off? Am I going to land on that rattlesnake? You know, whatever it's going to be. That's what playing music live is like, and so that's what's addicting. And that's why Bob Dylan still does it, you know. I don't know that for sure, but that's my guess. That and probably Bill's. But it's the immortality. When you're playing live and you're connecting with the audience, and especially in roots music, the audience it's almost as important as the music, if not more so, because it's that connection, that bond between the audience and the artist. It's the same thing that Ernest Tubb had for decades with his audience. You know, that same connection of, we like this weird stuff that no one else really cares for, right? And we share this. And you like this weird song of mine? I like it too, you know? And I mean, there's a guy wearing an Escarita t-shirt, and I just have to tell, we can wrap this up with this. One time Big Joe Turner was over having dinner at our house, and my dad and Big Joe Turner were having this conversation, and my dad was discussing, you know, and Big Joe were discussing class warfare and racial this, that, and the other. And then Big Joe said, and you know what? Never loan Escarita $25. That motherfucker borrowed $25 from me in 1954, and he never paid me back. And my old man looks at Big Joe Turner and says, well, I'll make sure I never borrow $25 from Escarita. And Big Joe's like, okay. So I'm sorry, I'm looking at that, and I'm just back at the dinner table, sitting there going, my dad and Big Joe Turner are discussing Escarita. Life is wonderful. That's why I still do it.
Last question. You know, in your various writings, I feel like first kisses and first heartbreaks come up a lot.
Yeah.
It's a reference point for you. And when I got the first Blasters record on Slash, and I'm listening to songs like Marie Marie and American music, I felt emotion in them. Emotion is what I discovered years later. That's what I've always been looking for.
Yeah.
And you had it. But there is a kind of vocational hazard with songwriters who do put emotion in. It's like they burn up some of it, and it doesn't go to the people in their lives. And they find, you know, many find balance. But it's easier to have that emotion inside the songwriting process. We were on the phone the other day, and at the end of the call, I said to Dave, Dave, I admire you, and I love you. And he said, great, I'll see you in Nashville. and I went, that motherfucker. Like I kind of set him up, and I was like, I wonder if he's putting too much emotion into his songs.
I don't know if you may not have caught my big boo-hoo last night on stage, but I got pretty teary-eyed. And, you know, emotion, yeah, you know, partially it's a family thing, you know. We show emotions in a weird way. We all show it differently, right? And have more mental health, you do have to kind of figure out how to balance your emotions. And emotions are also something, though, that in the music racket that we're in, you kind of don't want to show people your emotions, you know? Because if you show people your emotions, a lot of, you know, it's just safer to just not do that. You know, that kind of emotion. But I do love you, and I think about you all the time.
And on that note, Dave has some signed books that I think are going to be available out there, and they didn't ask me to sign mine just in case nobody buys them, but I'm going to be out there. If you buy one, I'll sign it. Dave Alvin, I love you.
If you buy one of Warren's, I'll sign it.